In the glittering, gilded cages of 19th-century European royalty, bloodlines were currency and marriages were treaties. A princess was a dynasty's most valuable asset, expected to be beautiful, dutiful, and, above all, fertile, but descended into a nightmare of betrayal, sickness, and public humiliation. Trapped in a loveless political marriage, she was infected with a venereal disease that left her barren at just 22, her primary royal purpose stolen from her. 2 years later, her husband's horrific final act would leave her a widow, a scapegoat, and a pariah in the very court she was meant to one day rule. The family's hopes rested on her older brother, Leopold, the young heir. But in 1869, when Stéphanie was not yet 5, tragedy struck. She was raised in profound emotional neglect, with a distant, imposing father obsessed with his colonial project in the Congo and a cold, inaccessible mother. The choices were limited. Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, at just 15, fit perfectly. He was 21, worldly, and known for his liberal ideas. It was a spectacle of imperial splendor, but for the young bride, it was the beginning of a waking nightmare. Plucked from the relative simplicity of the Belgian court, she was thrust into the heart of the Habsburg dynasty, a world of suffocating protocol and unforgiving scrutiny. The Viennese court looked down on her, considering her tall, awkward, and not particularly beautiful. The news was a death sentence to her royal purpose. She could never provide the male heir the dynasty demanded. This medical diagnosis was a profound personal and public humiliation. She was now seen as a failure, betrayed by the very man who should have protected her. For Emperor Franz Joseph, the first priority wasn't grief, but damage control. As the story of the murder-suicide leaked, the emperor had to secure a special dispensation from the Vatican for a Catholic burial, which would be denied to his suicide. She was immediately caught in the storm of the scandal. Instead of being treated as a victim, she became a target. Whispers swirled that her coldness or her inability to produce an heir had driven Rudolf to despair. Her father-in-law, the emperor, treated her with icy disdain. The Belgian royal family cut off all contact. The Habsburgs were equally scandalized. But Stéphanie, for the first time in her life, defied them all. When he lay on his deathbed in 1909, he refused to see her. With Elmer, who was later elevated to prince, she found the peace and affection that had always eluded her. They settled at a castle in modern-day Slovakia and lived quietly for decades. She even published her memoirs in 1937, titled, "I Was to Be Empress." She was born into a system that saw her as a vessel for alliances and heirs, a gilded object whose happiness was irrelevant. The title of the infected princess, while not a formal moniker, is brutally accurate. It was an infection transmitted through a politically motivated and loveless marriage that became the central tragedy of her existence. The venereal disease she contracted from Crown Prince Rudolf didn't just cause physical pain. It made her infertile, stripping her of her dynastic purpose and subjecting her to profound humiliation. Upon his death, she discovered he had left the bulk of his immense fortune, much of it extracted from the brutal exploitation of the Congo, to his mistress, which left her a widow and a scapegoat at just 24. Her story is a stark reminder of the vulnerability of even the most high-born women in an era before modern medicine and before they had agency over their own bodies and destinies. While she eventually found personal peace, it was only after being cast out from the royal world that had so thoroughly broken her. Her life wasn't a fairy tale, but a cautionary tale, a tragic testament to the suffering hidden behind the polished, imperial veneer of 19th-century Europe. On March 22, 1900, at Miramare Castle, the 35-year-old Stéphanie married Count Lognier. It came at an enormous cost. By marrying a man of unequal rank, she was forced to renounce her title and privileges and was excluded from the House of Habsburg. In 1945, as the Soviet Red Army advanced, she and her husband fled their home, finding refuge in the Pannonhalma Archabbey in Hungary. It was there, on August 23, 1945, that Princess Stéphanie died from a stroke at the age of 81. A year before her death, she had disinherited her only daughter, with whom her relationship remained strained. She was buried in the abbey's crypt, a quiet end to a life defined by public tragedy. Her beloved husband, Elmer, died less than a year later and was buried beside her. Her daughter, Elizabeth, broke off all contact, a painful estrangement that would last for years. Rudolph's farewell letter to her offered no love or regret, only a cold release. Dear Stéphanie, you are free from my presence and plague. Be happy in your way. Be good for the poor little one, who is the only thing left of me. A medical certificate was produced, declaring Rudolph had been in a state of mental imbalance. If you find these forgotten lives and the brutal reality behind the royal facade as fascinating as we do, please consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these compelling stories. It destroyed her reputation and her position. She was no longer the future empress, but the Dowager Crown Princess, a title that felt like a brand of shame. She was an outcast in the court, a living reminder of the scandal. Her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, took over the guardianship of her daughter, Erzi, further isolating Stéphanie and straining their mother-daughter bond. Suffocating in Vienna, she traveled extensively, seeking refuge from the whispers. She found a brief new love with a Polish count, Artur Potocki, but he died of cancer just over a year after Rudolph's death, adding another layer of grief. Trapped in Vienna, she begged her father for permission to return to Belgium, but her request was denied. She was forced to remain in Austria, a prisoner of her title and her tragic past. The scandal was unthinkable. The initial public announcement was a lie. The official story claimed Rudolph had died of a heart aneurysm. Mary Vetzera's existence was completely erased. Her body was smuggled out of Mayerling in the dead of night, propped up in a carriage to appear alive, and buried in secret. The knowledge that her infertility was his fault created a chasm of resentment that could never be bridged. Her conservative nature clashed with the liberal circles her husband frequented, and she found herself isolated. Both her father and the emperor wanted her to remarry, suggesting Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the new heir. But Stéphanie had no intention of being a political pawn again. She had her own choice. A Hungarian nobleman of a much lower rank, Count Elmer Lonier. He was Protestant and not of royal blood, an unthinkable match. He became increasingly dependent on morphine to manage the chronic pain, and his behavior grew more erratic and morbid, and excused himself from a planned shooting party at his hunting lodge, Mayerling. It was the last time Stéphanie would see him alive. Instead of hunting, Rudolph had arranged for his young lover, Mary Vetzera, to be secretly brought to the lodge. He even proposed a suicide pact to one of his mistresses, who wisely refused. Alarmed by his internal dissolution, Stéphanie tried to warn Emperor Franz Joseph about his son's state, but her concerns were dismissed. By late 1888, Rudolph had become entangled in a new, intense affair with a 17-year-old baroness named Mary Vetzera. It was a reckless, all-consuming obsession, and for Stéphanie, it was the prelude to the event that would shatter her life. To the sheltered Stéphanie, he must have seemed like a figure from a storybook, but the reality was far darker. Rudolph arrived in Brussels not just with his official entourage, but with his mistress in tow, a fact Stéphanie would only learn later. On the morning of January 30th, Rudolph's valet forced the door open and discovered a scene of unimaginable horror. The 30-year-old crown prince and the 17-year-old baroness were both dead, shot in an apparent murder-suicide. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had killed his teenage mistress and then himself. Rudolph plunged deeper into his dissolute lifestyle, while Stéphanie was left to navigate the hostile court alone. Her mother-in-law, Empress, held her in disdain and offered no support. Then, in 1886, the true horror of her situation became clear. Both Stéphanie and Rudolph fell gravely ill. Stéphanie was diagnosed with peritonitis, a severe inflammation of the abdomen. The source was a secret the court desperately tried to conceal. Rudolph had contracted a venereal disease, most likely gonorrhea, and had transmitted it to his wife. Barely 16, she was given no choice. This was her duty. She consented, unaware of the abyss she was about to step into. The engagement was formalized, and a year later, she would travel to Vienna, leaving her cold childhood for a court that would prove infinitely more cruel. Her mother was a Habsburg archduchess, and the Belgian monarchy was wealthy and important. To her parents, it was the ultimate prize. For Empress Elizabeth, however, the match was less than ideal. She looked down on the new Belgian monarchy. Rudolph was a complex and deeply troubled man, intelligent and politically liberal, but also emotionally unstable. prone to depression, and a rampant philanderer. His countless affairs were common knowledge throughout Vienna. Stéphanie, raised in a strict environment, was completely unprepared for her husband's debauchery. Her only truly important duty was to produce a male heir. In September 1883, she gave birth to a daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, known as Erzi. The arrival of a daughter was met with thinly veiled disappointment. The empire still needed a future emperor. She would be their only child, but Emperor Franz Joseph approved. This lonely world was the only one Stéphanie knew before she was thrust onto the international stage. In 1880, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was seeking a bride for its heir, Crown Prince Rudolf. The son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and the famous Empress Elizabeth, or Sissi, Rudolf was under immense pressure to marry and produce an heir. The young prince fell into a pond, contracted pneumonia, and died. The loss was catastrophic. Queen Marie Henriette was devastated, and King Leopold II, shattered by the loss of his only son, sank deeper into his ambitions, effectively abandoning his surviving children. He treated his daughters as little more than political pawns. The death of her brother, an event Stéphanie later said was the first to be deeply etched in her memory, was also the death of any hope for paternal love. This is not a fairy tale. This is the tragic life of the infected princess. In 1871, a deadly wave of typhus swept through Brussels, and the princess, not yet 7, fell gravely ill. For weeks, she hovered between life and death. Her terrified parents, having already lost one child, kept a constant vigil. Against all odds, credited to an unconventional treatment of cold baths, Stéphanie survived. But the experience was another dark omen. She had survived, but the gilded cage she was born into felt more and more like a tomb, shadowed by grief and disease. She was born to be a queen, destined for the grandest throne in Europe and a jewel in the crown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. She entered a world that was, on its surface, one of immense privilege. His personal life was a string of mistresses, and he viewed his children with a chilling detachment, especially his daughters. Her mother, Queen Marie Henriette, was passionate about horses and music, but found herself trapped and responded to her husband's indifference with a rigid, cold demeanor. This created a home devoid of warmth and affection. It was a haunting prelude to the tragedy her own marriage would become. Her father was soon to be King Leopold II of the Belgians, and her mother was Archduchess Marie Henriette of Austria. But this union was a textbook political arrangement, a miserable mismatch that cast a long, cold shadow over the palace and Stéphanie's own destiny. Instead, she became a prisoner. Her body was ravaged by a disease given to her by her own husband, and her future was destroyed by a scandal that would echo through history for more than a century. This is the story of Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, a woman whose life began with the promise of an imperial throne. Princess Stéphanie Clotilde Louise Herminie Marie Charlotte of Belgium was born on May 21, 1864, at the opulent palace of Laeken. Her father, Leopold, was a man consumed by ambition, focused on wealth and the aggressive expansion of Belgium's colonial power. The darkness that would define Stéphanie's life arrived early. Just 2 years later, death came for Stéphanie herself. Her childhood was one of iron discipline and emotional austerity. The criteria were specific: a Catholic princess from a reigning house. In March 1880, Crown Prince Rudolf traveled to Brussels to propose. On May 10, 1881, 16-year-old Princess Stéphanie married Crown Prince Rudolf in the Grand Augustinerkirche in Vienna. The marriage, arranged for political reasons, was fragile from the start. Soon after, the marriage completely disintegrated. The consequences were catastrophic. The infection destroyed her fallopian tubes, rendering her permanently infertile at just 22. Rudolf's own health, meanwhile, was in rapid decline. It's likely he had also contracted syphilis. The end came in the biting cold of January 1889. On the 29th, at a family dinner, Crown Prince Rudolf claimed he had a cold. What happened behind those closed doors is still debated, but the outcome was brutally clear. The news sent a seismic shock through the empire. But the truth couldn't be contained. For Stéphanie, now a widow at 24, there was no space for grief. The Mayerling incident was the climax of Stéphanie's suffering. In the aftermath of Mayerling, Stéphanie's life entered a new, desolate phase. The courts of Europe weren't finished with her, though. King Leopold II was incensed and threatened to disinherit her. Her own father remained unforgiving. When Queen Marie Henriette died in 1902, Leopold forbade Stéphanie from attending the funeral. Yet, despite the rejection, Stéphanie's second marriage was a happy one. The turmoil of the 20th century, however, would not leave her untouched. The stories of figures like Princess Stéphanie are often lost to the grand narratives of history, their personal suffering eclipsed by political events. Princess Stéphanie of Belgium's life is a devastating case study of how royal duty, gender inequality, and disease could destroy a woman. This personal tragedy was compounded by the public horror of Mayerling.